أعطي الآن الكلمة إلى ممثل لبنان فليتفضل.
شكرا حضرة الرئيس. اسمحوا لي أولا أن أهنئ الأردن الشقيق برئاسته لمجلس الأمن لهذا الشهر، كما أن أود أن أثني على العمل التي قامت به بعثة فرنسا في قيادتها لمجلس الأمن خلال شهر كانون الأول المنصرم. Mr. President, last July, when we spoke before this council, we commended the efforts of U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry for resumption of the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations in the hope that they will lead to a just and lasting peace, which in our view can only be based on the principles and rules of international law, relevant decisions of the United Nations, the Madrid parameters, and the Arab Peace Initiative. However, we also said, and excuse me for quoting from our own statement, and I quote, "Still, let us be loud and clear. The main danger facing such negotiations is the continuation of provocative Israeli actions capable of undermining it. To protect these negotiations, they ought to be completely stopped. Obviously, there is no better example of such actions than the unabated construction in the past month of Israeli settlements at an unprecedented rate, let alone the approval of new settlement units." End of quote. In October, we sounded the alarm anew, drawing the attention of this Council one more time to the dangers of the unrelenting Israeli settlement activities on the prospects for the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, and we called on you to condemn them in the strongest terms. Mr. President, while this Council remained silent, the roar of the Israeli bulldozers destroying Palestinian homes in Jerusalem and uprooting olive trees in the West Bank to pave the way for still more settlements could be clearly heard. And, as it has already been mentioned, the Israeli authorities announced earlier this month their intention to build 1,400 new housing units in the occupied territories. Mr. President, we are sure you realize that we are at a historic crossroads. To say the least, the future of the negotiations has undoubtedly been put in jeopardy by the unabated settlement activity. The silence of your Council does not serve the cause of peace. To save the prospects for peace in our part of the world, you ought to make yourself heard. For the sake of peace, Mr. President, we urge you to act with no delay. Let me now turn to another challenge facing this Council. Last week, on January 15, and during the Second International Humanitarian Pledging Conference for Syria, hosted by the government of Kuwait, the figures spoke for themselves on the magnitude of the Syrian tragedy. Over 120,000 killed, including about 11,000 children. 9.6 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. 6.5 million internally displaced, and 2.2 million refugees in neighboring countries. It is an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe in recent history. Lebanon welcomed the generous pledges made during this conference and will continue to work closely with the donor community to alleviate the sufferings of the refugees as well as that of the host communities. As the conflict unfolds in Syria, the flow of refugees into Lebanon continues unabated, at an average of 3,000 a day. Months ago, their number exceeded 1 million, which is almost 1/4 of the population of my country. Clearly, this has begun to have an existential dimension in Lebanon, which is the smallest among host countries, while having the highest number of refugees, whether relative to the population of these countries or in absolute terms. Mr. President, the suffering of the Syrians in Syria must end, and the flow of Syrian refugees must stop. It's high time that the international community assumes its humanitarian responsibilities and acts in one voice to ensure humanitarian corridors for the delivery of aid in Syria, and to establish camps within Syria and on its borders which could allow for a dignified and gradual return of Syrian refugees from host countries to their own. to all those who may consider this to be unrealistic, allow me to say the following. While aware of its humanitarian responsibilities and legal obligations, Lebanon has kept its borders open to all those fleeing the horrors of violence and destruction in Syria, and will continue to do so. And what is unrealistic here is not to acknowledge that Lebanon can no longer cope alone with the pressures and burdens resulting from this situation. Moreover, since this Council succeeded in unanimously adopting Resolution 2118 on the elimination of chemical weapons in Lebanon, is it unrealistic to hope that it could still show similar commitment in addressing the humanitarian situation there? More importantly, on the eve of the date set for the Geneva II conference, is it unrealistic also to hope that this same international leadership will be renewed to ensure the full implementation of the June 2012 Geneva Communiqué and its action plan in order to help fulfill the aspirations of the Syrian people and to put an end to their ongoing ordeal? Mr. President, despite all the challenges facing one country, Lebanon remains committed to the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701 and stresses the need for you to act swiftly to put an immediate end to the systematic Israeli violations of Lebanon's sovereignty by land, air, and sea. My delegation have kept you informed of these violations and requested that its letters to that effect be circulated as official documents of the United Nations. The latest of these was on January 9, when we submitted a complaint against Israel for launching an electronic warfare on Lebanon. We informed you that Israel increased the number of sites, towers, antennas, and other monitoring, espionage, and surveillance devices that have been installed along the Lebanese border. We called on this Council to assume its responsibilities in the maintenance of peace and security by condemning such blatant violations of international law and taking the necessary measures to put an end to them. Mr. President, recently my country was also the victim of several terrorist attacks, from the targeting of the Iranian embassy, to the assassination of former Minister Mohammad Shattah, to the car bomb in the southern suburbs of Beirut, and to the attack in Hermel. Time and again, this Council condemned these attacks and stressed the need to bring the perpetrators to justice. Lebanon expresses its deep appreciation for your continued support to its stability and security. Furthermore, this Council welcomed last week the beginning of the trial proceedings of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon and stressed the vital importance of combating impunity for the long-term stability and security in Lebanon. In turn, the President of the Republic of Lebanon, General Michel Sleiman, clearly stated that, and I quote, "The start of the trials was a sure first step toward uncovering the truth behind the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri and would ensure that the perpetrators do not think that they could evade justice." End of quote. Finally, the launching of the International Support Group for Lebanon in September was based on the consensus articulated by the presidential statement adopted in July by this Council, which stressed, and I quote, "the need for strong, coordinated international support for Lebanon to help it continue to withstand the multiple current challenges to its security and stability." End of quote. In this respect, the group also underlined the importance of Lebanon's policy of disassociation and the B'abda Declaration of June 12, 2012. Mr. President, today and more than ever, such support is needed to help shield Lebanon from the spillovers of the Syrian crisis and from my country being turned anew into a battlefield of regional rivalries and proxy wars. Thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر ممثل لبنان على بيانه.